So thank you for everyone joining us here this morning, and thank you to those who have been following us on YouTube and viewing there. As some of you may know, we've been hosting these coach socialization series as a way to provide a platform for coaches to connect and continue to learn from one another and to learn from professionals on a variety of topics. So this morning we have Scott with us to discuss how to track athletes and how to monitor athletes, what, how, and why we do that. So Scott is a strength and conditioning coach with the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. He has worked with a variety of athletes in sports and Olympians. He's currently working with gymnasts and the Canadian softball team. I'm sure Scott can talk more about that, and he'll be providing us lots of useful tips and tricks of how to monitor athletes. So if you do have any questions throughout the period of this session, please feel free to write that in the chat box, and we will open up your mics at the end for a Q&A. So thank you, and Scott, take it from here.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Kirsty. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation for you guys, hopefully. There it is. All right, can you guys see my screen? I can still see you, so thumbs up would be good. Good, yeah, nice. All right, so this is kind of what I've got for you. I'm going to talk about monitoring athletes from the theory behind it to application of doing it. By the end of this, we'll kind of build a little mini questionnaire, and I'll talk about how you might use it really simply. I tried my best not to nerd out too heavily on this one because, you know, this is something that I do a lot of, and I'm really heavily kind of invested in this kind of athlete monitoring world using things like databases and you know, Excel and pivot tables and all that sort of stuff. So I tried to keep it as basic as possible so that you guys you know, can get started on it, assuming that you're not Excel wizards right now. If you are Excel wizards right now, I've got a couple of sweet references at the end of my presentation before we kind of go into the live mode of a couple people who are doing some really, really cool things in this area and have great YouTube videos, a series of YouTube videos on athlete monitoring and designing dashboards. So you can take the stuff that we talk about today and sort of move forward with that. So like Kirsty said, my name is Scott Wilgris. I work as a strength and conditioning and physiologist at the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. Currently the national teams that I'm involved in include Canoe Kayak Canada, the women's kayak team, Gymnastics Canada, the women's artistic gymnastics team. I've worked with one athlete for a really long time in that area, but I've more recently in the last 2 years joined the kind of national IST and have started to assist them. And one of my primary roles is actually getting the monitoring system set up and running for them. And then finally, I've worked for the last 4 years with the women's softball team. And that was one of the first things that I did there. They're a very decentralized sport. Not any more than 3 or 4 people are in one place, and I'm in the same place as 0 of them most of the time. So monitoring and figuring out what people are doing, it became a very, very important piece of the puzzle for us. I've got my social media stuff up there too. You guys obviously know the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic's social media information. In case you aren't following me and are curious to, I post things of this nature and also different exercise videos and all that sort of stuff. So if you're curious there, you can check that out. So moving forward, I always like to start with why. You know, that might have been the last thing in my title, but just to, you know, why would we be interested in athlete monitoring? What's the point, essentially? So workload management, you guys have probably started to hear that term a little bit. You know, that's thrown around a lot now, and especially in pro sports. We heard a lot about it in the lead up to last year's NBA Finals with, you know, Kawhi Leonard and how he wouldn't have been there, he wouldn't have been playing if it wasn't for workload management. So, you know, what does that actually mean? But it can be a key factor in injury and performance. So essentially, you know, and we'll go over this in a little bit, but most injuries and even, you know, there's a lot of proof that upper respiratory tract infections and other illnesses can occur when athletes are either not fit enough to handle the prescribed workload or are fit enough but are in need of a prescribed rest period. And the other one along those lines is athletes can be very susceptible to injury in situations where there's big spikes in workload. So those are the types of things that we're going to look at today. And clearly, if an athlete is injured or ill, they're not going to be able to play. And so, you want to have your athletes on the field, on the court, on the water, on the floor, as much as possible. You don't want them, injured from either overuse injuries or acute injuries, and you don't want them sick with upper respiratory tract infections and things like that. So if you can figure out what they're doing and how they're responding to the work, you're ahead of the game there. You can also, as coaches, really start to critically analyze the effectiveness of your training program. If you have a really well-rounded monitoring system set up, you can start to figure out if the prescribed training actually worked. Did it have the desired effect? Did you improve power? Did you improve speed? Did you improve effectiveness in the actual field of play? There's things that you can do there, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's this whole thing about responders and non-responders to different types of training. And, for me, what I've found over the last 10 or 15 years is really that people just respond to different things. So not everybody responds to the same type of training program. If you're kind of an aerobic-based sport or a middle distance-based sport, you might have athletes that are really, really far on the aerobic end of the spectrum, and they might respond very well to high volume training. But you also might have some athletes who are more on the anaerobic or the kind of sprint speed power side of the spectrum, and they might respond, really well to periods of high intensity and speed type training, but not so well to that aerobic piece. Because you've probably thought about working on the weaknesses of athletes, but at a certain point, you might want to start to think about working on the strengths and making those strengths even stronger. So if you can start to, through this monitoring type of a system, figure out what your athletes, what those individuals respond best to, you can, again, be really far ahead of the game, as opposed to kind of throwing, a little bit of everything at the wall and hoping some of it sticks. And that's something that, you might need to do that off the bat. And if you do a good job of monitoring the results of that, then you start to learn a little bit more, and you can individualize things and that sort of stuff. Do we actually know what was done? So, a lot of times as coaches and me in the gym, I can prescribe a whole bunch of stuff. We go through the motions, we get it done every day. But if there's no record of what was done, it's hard to go back and analyze, how it went. And I think that's a huge, huge factor here. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here with create actionable situations leading to better training adaptations. So, once you get that information, once you kind of figure out who is responding to what, what's the time course of adaptation, you can then start to use that information in your programming. Like maybe, you've always done a 12-week block of general aerobic fitness if that's applicable to your sport. But through this monitoring process, you start to find out that, the first 8 weeks are really good. People are doing really well. But then at, the last 4, everybody starts to get sick. Everybody might start to get injured because of the high volumes of training. Well, maybe that last 4 weeks is a little bit too much. And then, in future years or future training blocks, you can use that to flip it and switch the training when that's going to happen. So those are the types of things that you might be able to do. And actually, even within that 12-week training block that I just talked about, you might have the opportunity with this type of monitoring to make a change on the fly, right? And that's really what we're trying to look at doing. All right. So what are the key factors that we need to be monitoring if we really want to get an idea of what's going on? So what are the need-to-know metrics? The first one is probably internal training load. So what actually happened? There's a calculation that can be done to get training load or sessional RPE, which is kind of the term that gets used quite frequently. And the calculation for that is actually time. So minutes spent doing whatever the activity is that they're doing, multiplied by a rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. So you guys have probably seen this scale before, the RPE scale. Sometimes you'll see it as 6 to 20. There's a modified one that's 1 to 10, and that one's much easier to kind of pay attention to, or for an athlete, to look at. So you usually use the 1 to 10 rating of perceived exertion scale. We'll go over this in a bit more detail in subsequent slides, and then a little bit together at the end. The next piece of the puzzle would be the subjective training response. So, how are the athletes feeling is really what this boils down to. There's a few different questionnaires available. There's the classic one is the Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire, which actually asks 7 questions, and we'll go over all those in a minute. But you also really want to think about including things like hours of sleep, because as we're all starting to find out, sleep is one of the most potent recovery modalities there are. You know, you could talk about all the cold baths and, you know, compression garments and all that other stuff that you want. But if you're not sleeping, you know, probably at least 8 hours a day, most, if not all days of the week, you're way behind when it comes to recovery. So if you're tracking something like sleep for the athletes, plus the quality of that sleep, again, you're going to have a really strong understanding of what's going on with those athletes. And then finally, injury status is another neat one to look at. Just, you know, not only can you kind of figure out if your athletes are at a distance, or maybe they're not telling you everything, or they're not super good at, you know, speaking to these types of things, but will write it down in a questionnaire. You can then, you know, at least get a little bit of a heads up when something happens or if something's bugging an athlete. If you have a huge training group or something along those lines, but then you can also look at time course of improvements in recovery. And then finally, some type of physical response to the training. So this is where it gets kind of tough. You know, we don't all have fancy equipment. We don't always all have force plates or gym wear units or you know, tendos or whatever it is. So we can really boil it down to something simple. And that could be a broad jump, a standing broad jump. All you need there is a tape measure, and you could probably get a pretty good idea of what your standing broad jump is. And so that could be something that your athlete might track daily or every training session, or even weekly if that's all that you're interested in. And then you really kind of get an idea of what's going on. So like I'll have an example a little bit later of what I've used in monitoring at a distance. We've been lucky enough to get to purchase these accelerometer units. They're called push bands. And so, you know, we use the push bands with women's softball to monitor vertical jumps 3 times a week. And through that, we kind of get a really good idea of the physical status or the central nervous system status of the athletes, readiness to train. You know, how can they actually produce some speed and power? So I'll go over some results of that with you guys just so you get an idea of where you could take this coming up. So here's going to be our hypothetical questionnaire. So we talked about what are the need to knows. So let's go through what might actually look like. How long was your training today? Right, pretty simple, in minutes. Now, you might have multiple types of training, right? So you might have, you know, you might have your gymnastics specific training, but then you also might have a kind of non-gymnastic specific conditioning session, and then maybe a Pilates session, right? So you might want to split those up into 3 different things so you get an idea of the differences. The example I'll show you guys today actually includes results from hypothetical, actually real, but no named gymnasts. And we've actually, in our national team questionnaire, we've started to split it up apparatus by apparatus so we get an idea of you know, how much training is happening on each apparatus, and are there spikes in different apparatuses, and, you know, what effect might that have on you know, recovery, performance, and potentially injury. Because if you think about that situation, you know, a really big training spike in a vault, you know, with the high running speeds and the high landing impacts is going to be different than a training spike increase in something like beam, where there's still lots of high landing impacts, but it's a different type of training, of course. So how long is your training today? And again, that could be multiple things. Please rate your exertion, so on that RPE scale, and we'll go over that in our active session. But, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was that training that you did, that you're talking about with those minutes? And then again, you'd ask the same question for each of the types of training that you put in. How many hours did you sleep last night? Pretty straightforward. Please rate your sleep from 1 to 5, with 1 being poor, 5 being great. And one of we'll look at a couple of the anchors on either end of that when we go through the session. But, you know, you want to say, what does poor sleep mean? Well, maybe it means that you never felt recovered or rested the entire day. Whereas great means you were feeling really good, really fresh within 10 minutes of waking up. Please rate your injury status. This is another easy way to do this. You know, 1 is I can't train at all. I'm not injured, where I can't train at all. You know, 2 might then be I can train, but with huge modifications. 3 might be I can train, but there's small modifications because I'm injured. 4 might be I'm not injured, but I've got some, you know, aches and pains. And then 5 might be 100% training as usual. So that's just some examples of how you might do that. And then we might get into the Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire. So in the Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire, we'd ask us to please rate the following, from 1 being poor or problematic to 5 being great, awesome, no problem. And the areas that the Hooper-McKinnon suggests are fatigue, health, muscle soreness, training enjoyment, irritability. Sorry, I have fatigue in there twice, and stress. And we'll go over those in a bit. And then finally, please record your broad jump distance today. So this might be your kind of physical metric that you're looking at, right? So a couple calculations are needed there. Total training load, that would be the training duration multiplied by the RPE, and then, you know, add those up if there's multiple of them. That might be able to create something called a recovery score. And I've found this to be really nice to look at because, you know, with the Hooper McKinnon, there's those 7 different things. You know, you've got to think about sleep, like which ones are changing, which ones aren't. If you just want to get a broad, like quick check on overall recovery of the athlete, adding up all the Hooper McKinnons. So this is why I made it so that 5 was high, 5 was good, and 1 was bad. You know, you kind of add all those up. There's 35 possible there. Sleep quality is another one that you could have 5 if everything's perfect. So that's then 40 is our current potential total. And then we'll put sleep hours in there as well, knowing that that's very important, with, you know, a maximum of 10 being the kind of, you know, 100% score on the sleep quality. So now we've got a maximum of 50. So we add all that stuff up, divide it by 50, and we get a recovery score that's basically a percent. So, you know, if an athlete adds up all the Hooper McKinnon, adds up their sleep and all that stuff and gets 40 out of 50, that's then obviously going to be an 80% score. And then there's some next level stuff that I'll probably quickly touch on towards the end, but we won't go too crazy. But again, it's some stuff that you can do some extra reading on if you're very interested in this this area. And those are the acute to chronic workload ratios. And this is a calculation that's, you know, been made popular by people like Tim Gavitt out of Australia. It's coming under some fire recently in terms of the mathematics and the actual validity of like injury prediction. But I still think it's very, very useful just in the sense of understanding, you know, when are there training load spikes and when are we really low in our sort of overall training load and when are we really high. And this, you know, what the acute versus chronic means, generally it's 7 days divided by 28 days. So how much have you done in the last 7 days divided by how much have you done over the last 28 days. So is your body, you know, accustomed and ready to what you're asking it to do this week versus the previous month? And then taking it an extra level, there's strain and monotony calculations that have been published by a group with Carl Foster as the lead. Now these are fairly old, but it just gets at the idea that, you know, if you're not varying training, like if there aren't some days where training load is 0 and then some days where it's high within a week, you know, ups and downs, ebbs and flows, that's putting an athlete at risk because of the, you know, the repeated nature and the lack of rest and recovery. So again, we'll go over this stuff in a bit. So how can we get this information? You know, I've got an example here of Kinduct. It's one of the athlete monitoring systems that I've used mostly over the last few years. So that's definitely an example, but not everybody has, you know, the option to pay for an athlete monitoring system like that. So, you know, pen and paper is an option, and then you can manually enter it into Excel. Definitely a possibility, kind of annoying and tedious and a little bit of a long process for most of you. So Google Forms is actually what we're going to go over today. It's free, it's easy, and it's relatively automatic. I'll show you if we can't actually automate the reminders and that sort of stuff. I'll show you in a second how we're going to do that. And then finally, athlete monitoring system. So there's a bunch of them out there. They run, you know, anywhere from a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars a year. So, you know, I don't think that's necessarily 100% necessary, especially, you know, for a lot of the athletes that we're dealing with. But it's something that's there, and if people are interested in it, they can reach out and ask me a little bit more about it. So here's an example of, you know, an easy reminder. So I'll show you in a bit how we're going to create this link to a Google form, or how we're going to create a Google form. But what I've done in the past when I've used these is I've asked athletes to save this Google form website on their, or link, sorry, on their desktop. So that's where this blue arrow is pointing to. That's just a link there that you can save easily within your iPhone or your Android phone. So it's there. Then go over to your alarm. Now this might seem ridiculous, but go over to your alarms, set an alarm for every day, label it Complete Training Wellness Journal, set it for, you know, whatever time you guys want. I generally use like after dinner time when athletes, for the most part, are just chilling. Maybe they're done their homework and they're on their phones anyway. That alarm pops up, they go click on the link and they fill it out. And then we can go from there. So that's kind of an easy reminder setup that I've used in the past and seems to work fairly well. I mean, so now what I wanted to get through to you guys with this one is that it can become crazy. Like if you set up one of these Google spreadsheets and you ask a bunch of questions and you've got a ton of athletes that are filling them out all the time, you end up with a huge data set. This is an example of just a screenshot from my information that we gather with the women's softball team with Push. And you know, it's lots. It's like I think 26 columns, and at some point I had like 500,000 rows, and there's a ton of stuff there. So you know, you have to figure out how you're going to condense that information into something that's usable. And I use this analogy of drinking water out of a fire hydrant, because you know, you get all this data coming in at you, and if you don't have something set up that's relatively easy and kind of almost automatic for you, you're probably going to stop looking at it, and it's not going to be usable. So I'm going to attempt to give you a couple of easy tips and tricks of organizing information once it comes in. So here's that sort of the rundown here. Like I'll give you guys a couple of examples before I go too much further. You know, I use Excel and pivot tables a ton, and I'm going to go through how to build a really simple pivot table with you guys with a data set in a bit. What I would then suggest that you do is build individual sheets. Right, so you can look at, this is an example from the women's softball team. These are all initials of the players, so each of them has their own sheet that looks like this. We won't go quite into as much detail today. I'll kind of get you started, but it's just an example of what I've done. You know, I then use like daily averages. We calculate some Z scores to start to look at the differences in those same individuals, like acutely. Same thing as the idea of the acute to chronic workload ratio. So what is their, you know, their health response this last week versus the last 28 days? Is that changing up or down, positively or negatively? And you can do that for all of the different ones if you want to. And then finally, the acute to chronic workload ratios. We'll go over that when we look at the sheet. So this is kind of what my suggestion is going to be from today. I'll give you guys a couple more. So these are sort of maybe next level sort of situations that you might create. So, you know, with the softball group, I talked about doing those 3 times a week jump monitoring sessions. If you look at the top right graph, this is an example of a fairly bad day where almost every player, so each gray bar represents a player, and then being positive, so above 0, represents currently jumping better than you have been over the last month, and the negative stuff that's on the right of that chart represents currently jumping worse than you have in the past month. So, you know, you might look at that and say, oh man, that strength coach really sucks. Or you might look at it and say, okay, we've achieved a goal that might be right now overreaching a little bit, you know, pushing the envelope a little bit further than we have before. People physically are not doing awesome, but maybe it's time to back off. It's time for a recovery week or something along those lines, right? So now we kind of have that idea based on the chart that we have here, knowing that, you know, the majority of the team are trending negatively in their jump score. You know, and I'll show you how to set the bottom right chart up as well. What this is a representation of the entire team. So each dot is a player. It's a quadrant style graph looking at their Z score, so how their training is currently compared to how it has been over the last month, and also their recovery score, how that is compared to the last month. So, you know, the further up on the chart they are, the more training they're currently doing compared to what they had been previously doing. And then obviously the lower down on the chart, the dot is the less training they've been doing. The further to the left, the less recovered they are compared to how they have been, and to the right is the more recovered they have been. So if you set this up for an individual, you get an idea of how the individual is doing. If you kind of create a chart where the whole team's on there, you get an idea of how the team is doing, and you can sort of pick people out. Like in this case, those 5 dots on the far left are all athletes who are under recovered compared to their usual. So overall, their subjective scores are worse than significantly worse than they normally are. So again, I'll just give you guys a quick shot into how to do something like this in a bit. I've talked about that already. Here's an example of, you know, if you kind of go back in your history of your training year kind of thing, and you have all this information, you can really start to get an idea of what went on when. I won't go into a crazy amount of detail on this. I just wanted to show you, like, you know, how I've used monitoring in the past to I guess confirm that things went the way that I thought they went, and then to use it for planning in subsequent years. So the chart on the right here, sorry, the chart on the top represents the black line is actually the team average in jump velocities. So the team average for jumping, and higher is better, higher is faster, lower is worse, and you get an idea of when there were peaks and when there were valleys. You can kind of see on the far left, that's like the off season. They're not actually playing. You see a decent amount of valley there when they're training hard, but not really ever given that full kind of rest period until you get to that first set of kind of blue, vertical blue boxes on there, which is actually a kind of a rest taper period leading into testing. And then you see that I saw that I could, in fact, get them out of that hole that they were in, given a specific type of taper. So, knowing that this is a long season, so if we look at the horizontal axis, we're looking at on the far left, it's early January, and on the far right, it's late August of last year. This team had basically one key event in mind, which was the Olympic qualifying tournament at the end of the summer. So I knew the whole time that I wanted to have them in the best physical condition. I mean, obviously that's the area that I'm responsible for, that I could. So how was I going to do it? So I knew that, after that kind of little mini peak and taper, that was sort of a test to see how, how a taper would work in April, where we see this kind of first peak here. I knew I had to put them back into a hole physically to make sure that they are going to continue to adapt. And so you kind of see that occur here, right? They get down into a hole, they then get into their season. They have a bit of a spike and then a dip and then a spike and a dip. And, based on the training that I was doing during the season, I was able to, notice when the peaks happened and try to recreate that when it was the most important, which was the end of the year. Finally, on the bottom here, this is just our training loads. So we talked a little bit about, how we're going to calculate training loads. So this is a weekly rolling average of strength and conditioning training in orange. You can see the peaks and valleys here in the off season, and then where that kind of dips. And then the blue would be the softball training load. You see peaks and valleys here, given tournaments and travel and that sort of stuff. And you can kind of notice, where the big dips are, kind of coincide with huge softball training loads, but also maybe after small peaks in strength training loads. So you get an idea here of how you can retroactively look at this stuff and say, okay, now I know what was happening at these different times of the year. Did it go well? Did it not go well? What should I do about it? I think this is my last slide on this, and then we'll go into Google Forms. But basically, at the end of the year, so if you look at the top, the chart on the top left, that's just jump velocities for each individual player, and the chart on the bottom is actually the same thing. I split it up into who responded well, who generally tracked positively throughout the year, whose slope was up, and whose slope was down. Again, this is during the season, so this is May to September. So when I looked at the 4 players on the bottom, they all had something in common, and that was that they reported less than 7.5 hours of sleep on average over the season. So I thought that was huge. And I actually did a little bit further statistical analysis on this, and it was a significant group difference in terms of the players who slept less didn't respond or didn't improve during the season like we wanted them to. So this was the information we were actually able to go back and give to them, saying, hey, if there's all these different sleep hygiene pieces that we can give them, or pieces of advice. But there was one player who actually we sort of figured out that she may or may not have a sleep disorder. So we were able to get her in contact with a sleep specialist, and they took it from there. But these are the types of things that if you have this information, you can show the players how, okay, 15 of the 20 of you guys responded really, really well in terms of your jumping through the season. Some of you didn't, and you guys all had something in common, and that was lack of sleep. So that's essentially where I'll stop in terms of this kind of stuff, the information, like the why and the what are we looking at, and then I'll show you guys how. Before I take my presentation off the screen, these are 2 actually really, really good resources to take this sort of database, like dashboard building in Excel to another level. Again, I'm going to scratch the surface. I've been watching some of Adam Virgil's stuff recently. He's done a really good job. He's got like a 20-part Excel tutorial that if you really want to build a really cool dashboard with your logging stuff, you can. And same with Dave Scott McDowell. Now they both kind of market themselves to strength coaches or sports scientists, but it's super applicable for coaches if you're like an Excel nerd and you want to get into that. All right. So I'm going to take that off the screen. Let's see. Does anybody? No questions yet. So what I wanted to do is, in case some of you guys are not familiar with something like Google Calendar, sorry. I wanted to go, or sorry, not Google Calendar, Google Forms. I wanted to go in there and show you guys how to do it. So if you have a Gmail account, you'd generally be able to click up in the top right corner here on this little series of dots, right? And then we're going to go into Google Docs. Once we go into Google Docs, you can click on the top left main menu, and it gives you the option of creating a few different things, right? So if you want to create a form, this is how we're going to build our training, our questionnaire. You can create a form. If we want to look at starting from new, we'll click on a blank one, right? And then we can name it training, training log. And we can then, create our first question. What is your name? If we want to make it short answer, and actually Google's gotten really good recently in terms of, based on what the question is, it auto populates what type of question you think it thinks you should have. If you then want to make it really, really easy, you can duplicate that question and say, what is that you are looking for? Right, so you've got that, and then this might be a date, right? So you can click on it. Okay, so now we've figured out how to get into it and how to start. I'm going to go back here and look. I've started to build one for us already a little bit. And this is it right here. So training and wellness questionnaire. I asked what is our name? How many hours did you sleep last night? Let's insert one if we want, just because we want to get the date. What date? Boom, it's there. We'll call that required. We'll call the name one required. And then start to build out your questionnaire, right? So I've got, the sleep quality ranked from 1 to 5, poor, never felt rested today, great, felt rested soon after waking up. How would you rate your health? Right, so that's one of the Hooper McKinnon questionnaires. Let's duplicate that one and just change health to something like irritability. Right, so we've got that one now, it's done. And then we'll do one more just for the purposes of today. We'll go to muscle soreness. Right, so then this is now a linear scale, gives them the option of 1 to 5, and this is how it's going to show up when they're actually logging it. We then want to have more of the training load information. Right, so the first question we would probably have, like we talked about, how long was your sport training today in minutes? And then they have a short answer. And you can actually set a couple things, because in the past I've had the issue where, if you're going back to look at this data and they enter something like 10 minutes, like they write the word minutes, that's a problem. You can't calculate based on a number and letters. So you can now tell it to specify that it's a number. It has to be a number. and then if they do it wrong, they get back this thing saying, please only answer a whole number. Right, and then you can also have your rating of perceived exertion piece, and you can insert pictures. So all I did here was I clicked on this add image when I created my how would you rate your exertion RPE sport training today. Went online, found a good RPE scale that did the job of what I was looking for. So from very light activity all the way to maximal effort, and then they can answer that question as well from a 1 to 10 scale. So again, if we wanted, so this is our sport training, we want probably to have, maybe let's say we want to have our strength and conditioning training, so we'll just duplicate that one, go in and say S and C, and duplicate this one, and call that S and C as well. Okay, so now we've got a decent, we've got a pretty decent little log here. We're missing some things, but again, we can come back towards. Sorry, you guys can, if you want to, you can start building your own. You've got the idea of how to do it now. One of the key pieces here is make sure that you go into responses when you're done. tell it to create a spreadsheet, right? So create a new spreadsheet, boom, so that's created now. Now the answers are linked. So now what I'm going to get you guys to do is I'm going to send you guys a link to this on our chat, and I want you guys to fill it out, and we'll see how quickly it populates. So I'm going to generate a link. Here's our link. You guys can use whatever information you want to do it. So where's our chat? Maybe I have to stop sharing to see the chat? No, it's not possible. All right, so in the chat, I'm writing in here that Google form. So if you guys just copy paste that and just fill out the form as quickly as you can, we'll get an idea of what the athletes might see when they actually do it. And I'm going to start to share my screen again. While we're kind of waiting, I'll just tell you what we have left on the schedule while you guys are running this down. So next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a sort of a dummy spreadsheet or a dummy data set and just quickly run you guys through how to create a pivot table with it. So once we have, I won't use the information here because it won't be quite as useful in terms of looking at longitudinal information, but this is what we're looking at here. Okay, so we've got the chat. Oh, come on. Okay, so I just have to access it. Sorry, guys. So to do that, that's a key step that I missed. Is actually go into settings, and it defaults to requires Canadian Sports Center Atlantic and trusted organization. So I'm going to remove that as a requirement, and I'll save that. And now you guys are in. Sorry about that. See, we're kind of learning together. That's good. Again, don't feel like you have to answer all of them for now, but I just thought it would be interesting to see all of the information that would come through and that sort of stuff. All right, there we go. I've got Jared's, I've got Megan's. Oh, Megan needs to work on her sleep, maybe. It's okay, it's easy not to sleep when you don't have much else to do in the day. There we go, we got Jake's coming in. Oh yeah, but my wife had, well, we've had 3 kids, so I haven't experienced it myself, sadly, but I have, or not sadly, but I definitely have been secondhand to that situation for sure. Okay, so we've got 4 people now. That's pretty good. I mean, so now we can kind of scroll through, and you'll see what we get to see here on the side. So we're kind of looking at. I want to see more of you guys' face. Yeah. So now we're looking at, you know, how would you rate? Oh, there's Kirsty's. Nice. How would you rate your sleep quality? You know, we've got some 4s and some 1s. So again, different stuff. You know. How would you rate your health? Most people are feeling relatively healthy. How would you rate your irritability? Some are good, some are not so good. Might be connected with sleep, not sure. How would you rate your sport training, how long was your sport training today? You know, some people train for 3 hours, others 0, which is normal. How about your S&C? You know, lots of us trained a little bit. How would you rate your RPE and that sort of stuff? So now we've got this data set, right? And just like I kind of talked to you guys about before, if you don't have a way to easily look at it, it's going to be tough to use. So I've got 5 different people here with a bunch of numbers. That's great. I can look at it and eyeball it and see. But if we want to look at some differences, I'll show you how you might do it. So what I generally actually do is using the databases that I work with, like Kinduct, I actually export the data in a CSV file and copy and paste it into Excel. So what I would do in this case is I would just, because we've never done this before, I would create a new spreadsheet, right, with this information. We'll just say that for fun that this is a totally blank spreadsheet, and I would paste it up here, right? So now I've got this data. Then every time I get more data, right, I would remember, okay, I finished up on April 16th, so maybe I do this once a week, or maybe I do this every Tuesday and Saturday to get an idea of how training is going. I go into my spreadsheet. I look for the new information. So let's say that just down here we've got however many pieces of new information. Copy that over and paste it in Excel below, right? And then we can start to do some of our manipulations. So I'm going to flip over to a previously existing data set that I had, right? And I talked to you guys a little bit before about how this was, what sport this was from. So this is from gymnastics. So I've got, I think, six different athletes in here. I don't have their names on. I've changed it to athlete A, athlete B, and all that sort of stuff. But just pretend for now that we did exactly what we just did. Athletes were logging daily for the last few months, and I want to create some sort of usable thing to help me look at their information that they've sent. So again, this is in order only because I have it alphabetically, but I mean, if I put it in order of date, over here it would be all over the place, right? Athlete A, B, C, D, F, A, C, and all that sort of stuff. Right, we've got injury status. And then the way that I split it up for them was, again, minutes on bars RPE, bars training load is a calculation, beam RPE, beam training load, beam training time, and so on. And then the Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire is at the end here. Fatigue, health, irritability. Again, all of these are ranked. We did the same sort of calculations I talked about before. So, we have a recovery score for everybody. We have apparatus training time, and then we have other training time, which obviously more recently is spiking because most people aren't in gyms. So here's a blank sheet. Like, say we've got nothing so far. Here's how we can do some pivot table work. So we're going to go into our Excel dashboard, look at insert, and go pivot table, and then it asks you to select a range. So then I will go back to my data tab, select everything that I have here. This is one easy way to do it. Once you've selected, you want to get rid of the actual row numbers. So I want it just to be all of all of the data from A to AI and all the way down, so that when I add more stuff, it automatically looks for it. So now I've got a pivot table, kind of the idea of a pivot table set up over here. One way I might want to look at this information is to see all of the dates that we want to look at in rows, right? So down below. If the pivot table, Excel usually groups it into months if there's multiple months. So I'm going to ungroup it so we see every day. And then let's say I want to see the most recent stuff coming up now. Right? So I'll just also go in and I'll ask it to stop showing me blank things. So now I've got all the days, all the row labels that are here that are set up that I might be interested in looking at. And so the next piece of the puzzle could be, okay, now I just want to look at this athlete's sleep. Okay, so that's going to go into the values column. So right now what it's showing me, because it doesn't know any better, is the sum of all the sleep that was logged for all of the athletes on each day. Not super useful information. You might, if you're curious, want to summarize this. So you'd right-click on your sleep column, summarize it by average, and now this could be a little bit more useful information. Right now you're looking at the average of your team, their sleep each day for the last, however long you have. But again, you probably want to be a little bit more curious about each individual. So a really easy thing you can do in pivot tables is something called a slicer. So you can click on insert, go over to the top bar here, and it says slicer, add a slicer for name. And slicer is a fancy way of like an organizer, essentially. So slicer for name, okay. And now we've got all the potential athletes here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So I only want to look at athlete D, well, we might as well start with A. So we're looking at athlete A now. So now we know how much sleep this athlete is logged for each day for the last, since January 1st is what I downloaded. Right, so now I've got a bit of a chart here. let's say I'm also interested in throwing another column on this same chart that might include total training load. Okay, so just for ease of viewing today, we'll look at total training load. We'll go into we'll click on our pivot table, looking at the fields on the side here, and we'll select total training load, and we'll drag it down to values again. Okay, so now that's going to be the sum of the total training load for each day over the last period of time. And finally, we might be interested in their overall recovery score. So we'll take the recovery score from our list of variables, and we'll drop that in as well. So now we've got the recovery score for this athlete. One thing you'll notice is that it's kind of tough to make a graph out of a pivot table. So if we go here and we want to insert a chart, it's pretty limited in what you can do, like just because of the nature of pivot tables. So what I've done is I've set up a couple things on the other side to show you. Just to recap, what we've done so far is we have a data set. We've created basically a database tab with each of our columns labeled, our athlete name, our date of logging, and all of our different variables with the columns labeled, and then we've gone down here all the way across, right? So that's pretty straightforward. As long as your setup is like this, with each column labeled and the same data underneath each column, you're set up to make a pivot table. We then went in, we created a pivot table, we threw in a couple of the variables that we might be interested in looking at, and now we've got for each athlete, for one individual athlete, we've got a chart that shows our average hours of sleep. And you can actually go in and play around with this if you want to as well. Like you can look at conditional formatting here, and for that period, you can look at color scales. So you can do some things there if you want to. If you just want to do that, that's pretty simple. And then it's quite easy to flip between athletes, right? So now I'm looking at athlete B's information, athlete C, D, E, and so on. But, you know, so I went ahead of time and I just created a quick little dashboard. You know, this isn't fully encompassing, but it does the trick for some of the things we were talking about before. So I created a pivot table. I put it over here in column H, not that that's important. And then I just have two of the units that we're looking at: total training load, which is one of the more important ones, and then the overall recovery score. So from those two metrics, I can see you know, how much are the athletes training, and I can see how they're dealing with the training. How are they recovering overall, right? So I've got these two things in as my two columns, just like we did before. I've then got a bunch of calculations. This is where it gets a little bit crazy, but it's not as crazy as it looks. So I'll just quickly take you through it. I've got the calculations for acute to chronic workload ratio, which is that value that we talked about in terms of looking at training load spikes, which is simply the difference between the 7-day training load average and the 28-day training load average. Sorry, divided by the 28-day training load average. So again, looking at that, all I did was put in a value here at the top when average of 7 days, done, when average of 28 days, and then did that calculation over here. For Z-scores, again, a Z-score is a statistical way of talking about the difference of an acute value to a chronic value measured in standard deviation. So a Z-score of 1 means that you're 1 standard deviation higher than the average of a data set, or -1 means you're 1 standard deviation lower. So just to orient you to that a little bit. So again, I just kind of took, to calculate the Z-score, I took the 7-day training load variable, the 28-day training load variable, and then also the 28-day standard deviation variable here that you can see. And did that calculation like I just said to give us a training load Z-score, and then I did the same thing for recovery. So all this data, which is a crazy amount of metrics now, is only coming from training load and recovery score. But you're starting to get an idea of a story here, right? So now I've got a couple of charts set up. I've got a pivot table chart automatically set up based on this table. And it's just simply looking at training load day to day for this athlete, and it's looking at recovery score. So you can see peaks and valleys of training load and peaks and valleys of recovery score for this athlete. I've also then got a chart set up for acute to chronic workload ratio to see, you know, when are their peaks. The general idea is, you know, above approximately 1.3 to 1.5. So I've put it at 1.4 for now. Is kind of a red zone in terms of a big spike in training load. And then below 0.8 is generally quite low. Again, this is from Tim Gabbett's research. So I put a blue part there in the sense that, if your athlete's currently below that 0.8, it's a good idea. It would be a good idea to, gradually come back to training to avoid a big spike. And, we've looked at the training load from February up until basically a couple of days ago for this athlete with, a slight spike in late or mid-February, obviously a big dip when everything shut down in early March, and then they've kind of gradually come back, figuring out ways to train on their own. And then the final piece that I did here, just based on this information, is actually that quadrant style graph that I showed you in the presentation, with this black dot representing where that athlete is in terms of training load and recovery today, or in this case on April 12th. So this is just, the further to the right this athlete or this dot is, it's the higher the training load is, the further down, the lower the recovery score, and vice versa. So I've kind of quickly set up a really easy and simple dashboard that you can kind of look at. And again, if you wanted to, make changes or add different things in there, it'd be quite simple. You just get stuff out of the way. Look at what other thing you were interested in. So maybe you were just interested in sleep. Slide that down to your values section, and then you've got it here, right? With the way that this one's set up, I don't have a slicer right now. I just have the column labels, which are athletes, but I could also insert a slicer if I wanted to. So if I wanted to switch it, so now we're going to look at athlete C instead of athlete A, and things change automatically for us. Different spot on the recovery training load area, and also differences in their acute to chronic workload ratio. So that was a little bit of a journey into my Excel nerdery, but it's something that's quite useful, I find. And like those other resources that I showed you, there's hours of information there that can really be helpful if you do want to get into this type of stuff. So again, hopefully some of this was useful. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will accept any questions that anybody has. And yeah, so I almost went an hour there. Apologies if you guys were expecting 30. I knew that was not possible for me.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Scott. I am also like an Excel nerd to the fullest, so I love this stuff. I actually did something similar with my team this year. We had more of like a subjective questionnaire through Google Forms. And then, so I think it's really beneficial to coaches, just an idea too of like, maybe there's something going on in your athlete's life that you don't know about, like maybe they're not getting good sleep, maybe they have a lot of exams or something. So it's always great to include questions like that, and to keep on top of your athletes and make sure that, and monitoring your athletes, make sure they're performing. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to open up your mics or use the chat box.
I have a question, Scott. For the max recovery score, is that like a summation of some of the Hooper McKinnon questionnaire?
Yeah, I did go over it in the presentation. It was essentially the maximal score that you could get from the Hooper McKinnon plus hours of sleep. And then so the actual score divided by the total possible to give basically a %.
Nice, thank you. I may have one more. When you present some of the data to coaches or like sport coaches, and you're looking to like present like a dashboard, how do you decide what metrics to present? Obviously, they might have something in mind, but how do you prioritize certain testing information over others?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, what I try to do is, first of all, like I think you were alluding to, ask the coaches what they're interested in seeing. Like, are you interested in seeing, health scores? Are you interested in seeing training load scores? And, more than half of the time, the coach isn't 100% sure. So I try to keep it really simple to start with. I basically try to present training load scores or training load values and show charts on that, because that's something that they can immediately connect with usually. I try to include some type of recovery metric, so either that full-on recovery score or simply something like health or stress or something like that, because that's another thing that their coaches are generally interested in. And then sleep. So I usually just stick to those 2 or 3 really simple things: training load, recovery of some kind, and sleep. And then that kind of gives coaches an idea of what's going on. The other piece that I did that I showed you guys in the presentation, but didn't really show the setup of, was that team dashboard. And I think especially for team sport coaches or coaches with large groups of athletes, that's where it really becomes easy to look at. If they can see, you know, who do I need to worry about? Like who is a red flag in terms of, you know, maybe their recovery score is much lower than it usually is. That is where it becomes really powerful. Or who is, you know, seeing a big spike in training right now, something along those lines. So try to get into that area. Like if we can get a team dashboard set up where coaches can really see outliers, that's where it can become super useful for coaches as well, I found.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any last questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Scott. That was great. And just so everyone's aware, like this will be posted on YouTube, and I'll make sure to link some of those resources that Scott had in his presentation, just so that you can access those and go back on the presentation too to review any information that you may see valuable for your athletes. And if you have any questions about this presentation or future presentations or any feedback for our previous presentations, please reach out to me at comcoach@cscatlantic.ca. I just want to add on to, I don't know if some of you guys are aware, but Coach NS is offering free NCCP home studies right now. And some of those home studies are actually like pretty well linked to some of the monitoring that Scott was talking about in today's presentation. So you might want to check those out. So things like performance planning and is an NCCP course that would be linked to this. So definitely check that out if you want to continue your knowledge and get some professional development points on top of that. But we'll wrap it up for today. Our next session will be Tuesday. I can't remember. I think it's Tuesday evening with Tina on our mental performance consultant. So definitely check out that session. And thank you for attending today. And thanks, Scott.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Kirsty.